In the face of resistance, the Israeli government is standing firm. The 28th week of protests kicked off with rallies across Israel as the government is set to pass a bill that limits the powers of the court to implement the reasonableness standard. This standard allows the judiciary to overrule the government on issues they deem to be unreasonable. Whilst proponents of the law say that this gives the elected officials more ability to carry out what they were elected to do, opponents fear that the government will use this to carry out unpopular policies, such as allowing former convicts to serve in the cabinet and, as many critics fear, the annexation of the West Bank. On Tuesday, another day of resistance is anticipated, with planned blockades of roads and Ben Gurion Airport. But will it stop a determined, democratically elected government from fulfilling its promises? Does weakening the powers of the reasonableness standard benefit Israel by taking power away from unelected officials in favour of those elected? Or is the coalition planning a power grab? Is there any way out of this that doesn't end with the collapse of the government or a civil war? Should the government halt the judicial reforms?
So let's get to it, gentlemen. Should the government halt the judicial reforms? As always, we begin with our quick fire round, 30 seconds each to let your initial stance on the matter, and we'll pick up the conversation now from there. Professor Eldad, please take the lead. Your 30 seconds are on.
Thank you. I think the government should adhere to the plan, not necessarily in the same sequence as they planned it. They can do it in what they call the salami effect. Part after part, but they should listen to the voice from the streets, to the voice of a lot of people, but never surrender to a military pressure of reserve officers, because this is the end of any democracy in Israel.
Okay, Yariv Oppenheimer, your take?
Usually I will take Arieh Eldad's stand and will support it, but this is not the usual time. This legislation is not just another legislation about even war and peace, settlements, housing construction, taxes. This is about whether Israel is going to keep itself as a democracy or not. And this is something that even a legal government cannot legislate because it's illegal. We hear from all the legal advisors. So the best thing is for this government to do what they did before and to stop maybe in the last moment in order to prevent this catastrophe from happening.
Last but not least, Jeremy Saltan, your thoughts?
My thoughts are that a majority of Israelis would like to see some sort of agreement between the coalition and the opposition. We know that within the president's residence negotiations, this was the easiest of all the topics that were talked about. I think that most people agree that there needs to be some change in terms of the scope of the reasonability clause. I would like to see, for instance, additional softening, if you will, when it comes to what we call takeover caretaker governments and so on and so forth. But it's not difficult. We have 3 days of voting. Changes can be made. I'd love to see the coalition and opposition sit down and do that together.
Okay, gentlemen, on that note, let's please feel free to interact, to engage in a conversation. And Yariv, I do want to begin with you. Should unelected officials have more power than elected officials? That's the core of the question here, no?
Usually this is not the case. And usually the government in Israel, in the Israeli system, is very strong. It can make really all of the decisions that you can imagine. It cannot take illegal decisions. It cannot take decisions that will discriminate people. It will not take decisions that are actually war crimes, like Bezalel Smotrich pushing ahead. And for this, we need the Supreme Court, and we need the legal advisors. We need the people that will guard us from stepping one step further. And this is what the government would like to take out, to move aside. Why they are so eager for this so-called reform? They would like to do things that are unreasonable. They would like to have people in the civil administration that has no skills for that unless they have the political commitment. They want to see more corruption. They would like to see more things that cannot be done in a democratic system. This is why they are so obsessed with this reform, because they would like to change dramatically the character of Israel and then to use the force in order to do things that are are not reasonable, that you cannot accept in a democratic system. Therefore, the government has a lot of power to make huge decisions about the fate of Israel, about the reality of each Israeli. But they cannot cancel democracy. This is the argument here, and this is why I believe that there is still a chance that it will not pass.
So, Professor Eldad, who will guard the guards, as the old question goes?
There should be a balance between these three authorities, but we all, in every democracy, accept the fact that the Supreme Court should be the supreme interpreter of the law, but not of the real reasonableness. I mean, we trust them to interpret the law in the best way. But once it comes to reasonable things, their reasonableness is exactly as good as the last road worker in Tel Aviv. They have one vote. And the idea that 15 people are more reasonable than the rest of the people of the country is unacceptable in a democracy. We want a balanced democracy between these two forces, but not an overruling power to cancel any decision of the government once they think it's not reasonable. We had experience with many unreasonable decisions of various governments in the past, but we never stood a situation where supreme officers in the army will say, we don't want your reason. We want to decide for a small minority that holds important duties in the military, and we will decide, and this is a military coup.
So let's talk about this point exactly. Jeremy Saltan, should service be conditioned? Could the IDF punish those who will not show up?
Look, I think that most people will agree that the IDF should not be brought into any political fight. The IDF, like any other army in any other democratic country, must be above this fray. The idea that we can bring politics into the army is a very, very dangerous thing. I remember when I was in the IDF during the time of the disengagement, I very much disagreed with that policy, but I continued to fulfill my duties, even being stationed within northern Samaria. That is what you're expected to do as a soldier.
I did as well my reserve duty in the West Bank, and I never refused, although I thought this is wrong.
And you think that we should start refusing now, Yariv?
But I did it. Yes, because now this is not about political issues. This is about the basic structure of the Israeli democracy. And when
you think that the reasonability clause is different than Oslo,
definitely.
It's different than the disengagement. The reasonability clause, which is not even being eliminated, it's being limited in its scope.
Jeremy.
That is worse than anything until now. This is the time to bring the IDF into politics. This is just unacceptable, and the majority of Israelis are not there. Even a majority of the Israelis who are opposed to the current reforms going forward are not taking that position.
Please let me answer. When you speak about the Oslo disengagement, building settlements or dismantle settlements, this is a legal decision that the Israeli government can take according to the legal system in Israel. The Supreme Court allowed the Israeli government to build settlements. Therefore, I went myself to protect these settlements. But here, this is something that is totally illegal. The legal advisor to the government is saying that it's illegal. To legislate a law that will limit the power of the Supreme Court is actually to say to the soldier, no one is going to protect you because tomorrow you will get an order that might be not reasonable or even a war crime, and no one will be able to say whether this is legal or not legal. And this is a very dangerous thing for the soldiers themselves. This is
those
not another
talking
political
points,
issue.
those
This
talking
is
points
changing
would
the
be
rules of the game.
understandable if we were at the beginning of the process, where originally what was on the table was to completely eliminate the reasonability. But what you have here is a difference that's being made between the elected officials versus the appointed officials. You have also additional things that were put in to soften it. Again, what I would like to see is the opposition putting on the table drafts for language to go ahead and address some of the other things that I think are important to be dealt with before we get to the second and third place in the Plenum. But to say that something which is more or less along the lines of the current Supreme Court Justice Solberg, who is supposed to be appointed according to the seniority in about 4 years to be the president of the Supreme Court, so to suggest something that is close to what he's suggesting is something that is illegal, is just unacceptable. What you are talking about is a previous draft of the law. And that's not what's on the table at the moment.
To chime in, yeah.
Gentlemen, let me add one point. Yariv is right when he's saying that the government is trying to limit the power of the Supreme Court. And this is something new. But the power of the Supreme Court in Israel is not something that was allocated to them in the sixth day of creation. It is something that they accumulated by themselves, took by force, without the government or the Knesset interfering in it, in the past 30 or 40 years. And now the government is trying to bring it back to the point where it stood before the legal revolution of Aaron Barak. And this is completely legal, because Aaron Barak said so many times, I do it because this is what the law allows me to do. If you don't like it, please change the law. Now we change the law and they are shouting.
Of course we are shouting, because this is the path to become a non-democratic state. In Israel, let's be honest.
It wasn't
the government
a democratic
is very strong,
state
even today,
before the legal revolution of Aaron Barak.
This isn't an all or nothing thing, guys.
In
Israel, this is not all or nothing. You can come to a medium here.
No, it's all or nothing, because this is the beginning of
having that
a
approach
process, and it's
is the most dangerous thing, and that is not what we need right now. We have depolarization within the country, and we need to come together to be able to resolve this.
Okay, so are we across the tipping point, yes or no? We do need to take a quick break, gentlemen, but do not go anywhere. Stay with us, because we have so much more to unpack. Is there a middle ground when it is so black and white, so to speak? A few minutes, and we'll be back with part 2 of the summit. Do not go anywhere. Welcome back to the summit. Still with us, Jeremy Saltan, Professor Arieh Eldad, Yariv Oppenheimer. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for staying with us. We're also staying on topic, of course, but before we get back to our conversation, let's take a look at some sentiments of the public, if you will. Here's a fresh weekend poll from Israel's Channel 12. When asked the public, should the government take into consideration threats from reservists not to show up for duty, as we spoke before the break, 54% said yes, the government do need to take that into consideration. 36% said no. 10% do not know. Now to the biggest question of all: do you fear civil war? Is it actually feasible? 67%, 2/3 of Israelis said yes. 29% said no, they do not fear an actual civil war. 4% do not know. And are you in favor of the reasonableness bill? 46 are against. 31 in favor, 23 do not know, so quite a split there. So let's begin our conversation with another quick fire round, 30 seconds each. Would, should, could the government, the protests rather, stop the democratically elected government from fulfilling its legislation promises? Jeremy Saltan, take the lead, please.
I think that the right to protest is one of the fundamental rights in any country, in any democracy. And obviously, despite what others might like to think or say, it doesn't matter who's in power. You have to let the protesters go. and have their voice and have their say, if you will. But ultimately, it's the government's responsibility and authority to decide how much it listens to, or if it listens to them at all. And in a democracy, when you don't listen to the people, usually you pay for it in the voting box when it comes to the next election.
Yeah, if and when. Professor Arieh Eldad, your thoughts?
I think the question of reasonability is not important, because even if it's cancelled, the government, the Supreme Court can decide that they will cancel a nomination or a law from other reason. It's unthinkable. It's unlogical. The key issue is the committee to elect the Supreme Court, and on this, we must and we can sit and reach an agreement. And if this will be done, the protesters should stop.
Yariv Oppenheimer, last but not least.
Yeah, this is the emergency moment. This is the time of no return, because if this legislation will pass, so as Professor Eldad said, the next step will be to nominate judges that are supporting the government position and ending the role of the Supreme Court in the Israeli democracy. Therefore, this time, the protest should do whatever it needs in order to stop it that is not violent. Not coming to the army is not a violent thing. Protesting in the street is not a violent thing. To do whatever needed in order to prevent this government from destroying Israel democracy.
Okay, so let's begin our conversation from this point. Exactly, we are after another day of disruption and ahead of a day of resistance. We're talking about essentially a paralyzed country, highways blocked, etc. Should protesters be more considerate of quote-unquote ordinary citizens? Jeremy?
Yes, I think you also have to recognize, besides the right of protests to protest, people also have a right to go to work. People need to be allowed to be able to get to their place and be able to make a living. And if there are people that choose that they don't want to go to the protest or the counter-protest, they should be allowed to go ahead and do so. I think that's very clear, and I think that it's unfortunate that there are, we saw pictures, obviously, last week of ambulances that had problems in terms of certain areas of being able to get through. I think certain considerations need to be made so that you're able to allow everyone to protest and have their democratic right nurtured, but then also allow the other people to live their life as they choose as well.
First of all, according to the hospital, no one ambulances was stuck and didn't arrive to the hospital, so it's wrong. And there are also
the Magen David Adom released a statement.
Traffic jams and other things.
Not true.
The Magen David Adom, the ambulance service, released a statement.
More than that. Eventually, this is minor when you look at the legislation. The big thing here is not the protest, it's the legislation. And in order to stop it, I wish that the people in the parliament will see the polls, and they will see that the huge majority is against it. And there is not a wide consensus to change the rule of the game. When you are changing such a delicate things, you need to get a huge majority of the public, not to use some technical majority that you had in the election and to ignore more than half of the population. What we see in the polls, what we see in the street, that the majority of the Israelis are against it. And if this government is going to legislate, there is a price to pay, and this is the price, to divide the country, maybe to destroy the country. It will not be just demonstration. It will be much more difficult than that.
Professor Eldad, I can see,
I believe that protesters can march and shout slogans and make a lot of noise, but it is unethical for doctors to strike for the item of reasonability in the law. If they are ready to put their patients at risk or to kill them, knowing that if they don't come to the ER or to the operation table, some of their patients will die. This is unethical. Even civilians under the dictatorship have the right to live, and no physician in this country is allowed to to mix politics in his medical ethics. This is unacceptable. This is unreasonable. And once they do it, they pass a red line. And so, like firefighters, if they decide that they don't want the item of reasonability, and they stop putting fire off, and people will burn alive, that's just because somebody thinks that this is a dictatorship. People under dictatorship are not allowed to live or to
Professor
not
Eldad,
to be burned alive.
No one is going to shut down. No one is going to shut down the ER and not to allow patients that need a life-saving treatment. But you know that
Yariv,
we had strikes in the past in the health system. We had strikes in the past.
Just a minute, Yariv.
This will not be different than the past.
That's hollow slogan. I'm a physician. If you postpone tomorrow only the outpatient clinic of a neurological patient, and you know it takes 9 months for the next time that he will be able to see his neurologist, his brain tumor might be fatal. So don't tell me that this is not the OR or the ER, because any medical decision can take a life.
And the government need to take it into consideration when they are doing this very unusual thing of changing Israeli democracy. This is something that the government should take into consideration. You cannot force people.
Yariv, I just don't understand. What are the red lines? Maybe you can tell me. What are the red lines when it comes to what cannot be done? You are basically saying that everything is kosher, and there needs to be red lines. Okay, if you want the reasonability clause to maintain, you must give me a reasonable solution of what is no longer reasonable to allow in this type of a situation.
We are saying it all the time. For the last 6 months, we had huge demonstration with a tremendous amounts of people.
But what's not allowed? What are the red lines?
The violence. This protest will be very strong, not nice. Will do things that usually I will be against, but this time this is an emergency. But we are not going to use violence, and we are not going to harm other people or to block specifically people like the right wing are doing. When you look at what's going on in the street, the right wing is beating the people that are against this reform. This is the reality. In the reality, who is violence and who is threatening life is the people that support Netanyahu and the government, and the people that are not violence. And this is tremendous. Are the people that are going to demonstrate. So the red line is to fight the other people.
We have reached the red line of this conversation, unfortunately, only because of the break. Professor Arieh Eldad, Jeremy Saltan, Yariv Oppenheimer, thank you very much, gentlemen, for your time and insight. We appreciate it. Hey, I see you liked it. Want more? Just hit the subscribe button right here. Go on. I know you want to.